So let us now talk about the Corona satellite because this has come up a few times in the chat on our live stream. And again, we see in the new video that someone is asking about this. And of course, our good old friend Dark Fen had to come in and claim that the Tor level of that satellite when it was at its maximum was Tor 10 to the minus 9. And he has the calculations there. So I went over to ChatGPT and I was looking at some of their calculations. Well, when that satellite took the images over Russia, it dropped down to 100 miles. Plus, it didn't have to go through the Van Allen belts. Plus, it wasn't in a vacuum of Tor 10 to the minus 11 to 12. So, why would it need an atmosphere? I think it would need more radiation protection than anything because when I look at these images Jarrah sent, they're pretty nasty. They're unclear. They have a little fog on them, not too much, but it's pixelated. It's almost like you could see the radiation particles that have been smacking that film. So anyways, I'm going to let Jared take that part away here. So Jared, do you want to explain why that film worked?
Marcus has always talked about the Hexagon spy satellite and how they had to pressurize the film on those. He was arguing, this Dark River fellow, he was claiming that the earlier missions were unpressurized. And so I thought I'd look into that. I found this one document here which talks about earlier missions. They were called Discoverers, these Corona satellites. The earliest ones, they had unpressurized film, but they were using acetone-based film, I believe. This report here, it says, this system was designed to operate without pressurization, and the acetone-based film being used was tearing or breaking at the high vacuum existing in space and causing the cameras to jam. A solution for this problem was found by substituting polyester for the acetone-based film. The importance of the reconnaissance programs achieved by Eastman and Kodak in the film technology cannot be overemphasized. So basically what they were doing in the original films that they had, it was acetone based, and this was constantly getting too brittle in the vacuum of space and causing the camera to jam. Beginning with Discoverer 11, I believe it was, they switched over to this polyester type film. That was apparently working better in the cameras as far as not jamming, although their concern was mostly about the film actually functioning, able to slide through the camera, not getting caught, not getting broken or anything like that. But looking at the films, I got one of them. The first one to actually return the film was Discoverer 14. Now, looking at this particular footage from Discoverer 14, it's very, very fogged and grainy. First of all, this resolution is equivalent to about 12 meters per pixel. Okay, the Hexagon spy satellite had something more along the lines of 0.5. Looking at this video, this is not going to win any Pulitzer Prizes anytime soon. It's very, very grainy and very blurred looking, and I think that could be the effects of the vacuum. Looking at the Hexagon spy satellite image, it obviously, first of all, has better resolution. It too is a bit dark and whatnot, but it's night and day difference compared to the earlier images. So if you're going to be cited, I'm speaking to you, Darkfen, was it? So basically, I'm looking at this thing, right, and it looks to me like some heavy fogging and degradation to it. And keep in mind, right, if this is exposed to the vacuum of space, then first of all, the vacuum could be a default, and then secondly, there's the radiation that could be a fault as well. Obviously, even though it's below the Van Allen radiation belts, the earlier missions, they were taken at altitudes of up to 800 kilometers in altitude, whereas the Hexagon spy satellite was in the order of about 200 kilometers. And so the earlier Corona missions were taken at much higher altitudes, okay? And well, if the vacuum up there is going to be an issue to the film, why would you pressurize the Hexagon spy satellite, which was taken at much lower altitudes? Yeah, so I'm speaking directly to you, Darkfin. If the vacuum isn't a problem, why is this image so foggy looking, okay? First of all, why is it so foggy looking? And second of all, why, if the vacuum at 800 kilometers was no issue, why would you go to the trouble of putting pressurization on the later mission, which was at much lower altitude, at only 200 kilometers altitude?
No, just say it's a good point to raise that, because as you explained during our chat on Saturday, vacuum or pressure varies with height. The higher you go, the less pressure there is, and the more vacuum there is. As the atmospheric molecules are removed, whether they go off into space or there's just not enough of them, pressure will reduce. So the further you go away from Earth, the higher the vacuum, because the lower the pressure. So the idea that you need to use protection for a satellite at a lower altitude makes no sense at all. It's just wishful thinking.
And again, it comes back to this issue here is that, first of all, I find it interesting that they were talking about the original film they used. The acetylene was constantly getting jammed and broken and brittle in the vacuum of space. They used the polyester to try and overcome that issue. Now, it must be stated that the Apollo film also used a polyester type film. It was called P-Star. That was the brand name for Kodak's special type of polyester film that they would use on their SO type films. The point of contention with using polyester over acetone was that the acetone one was getting brittle in the vacuum of space, whereas polyester was to try and make it more resistant to functioning in the camera as it's going through this and that, going all kinds of different chambers and whatnot. But they didn't say anything about how it would be affected by, how the colors and whatnot would be affected by the vacuum. The early emissions, as far as I can tell, they only used black and white. The Hexagon spy satellite, I believe it used both color and black and white, but I've only been able to find the black and white films at this stage. I've looked online and all I can find is the ones that they've released. It must be stated as well that these pictures were not released until the Clinton administration. They were all declassified then, so I assume these are first generation ones. The lunar orbiter pictures, for example, they were distributed to the public by taking a photograph of the computer screens that were displaying the television feed that they were getting. They had the onboard camera would be developed on board, and then they would be scanned, and then they would send the scan over the radio, and that would be received and displayed on the TV screens. They would record that, obviously, to videotape, rather than releasing a clean, pristine image of what they were receiving. What they released to the public was photographed off TV screens. It wasn't until the Lunar Orbiter Image Recovery Project that we actually got to see these unfiltered images. But of course, in the case of the Corona images, they didn't release those to the public until the Clinton years, till the Clinton administration. And so I assume that what we're getting shown here in these spy satellite pictures are unfiltered. And if this is unfiltered, my golly, that looks like some severe damage to the film. It's all I can see is this grain. There's the detail here. There's no detail. At first I thought, until I read the caption, I thought that was a building, but no, it's a runway.
Yeah, it's not very clear, is it? According to ChatGPT, once the satellite reached Russia in orbit, they lowered the satellite down to 100 miles to take those images. And they're not very clear at all. You have to wonder about this outgassing and solar particle events and cosmic radiation bombarding that film. Because according to the article that we showed in the last video with Dave, even NASA's own article there said that they had radiation fogging in that film when they were testing it. Back to the same question Dark Fen is trying to say. Oh, well, they didn't have an atmosphere in there. Well, the question is, did they require one at that altitude?
From what I can tell is that the early ones which didn't use an atmosphere, they incredibly fogged and grainy. Okay, granted it's a lower resolution than the Hexagon image, but still you should expect to see some detail in here. There's no detail in this. Is that supposed to be vegetation or is that rocky terrain? What am I looking at? It looks like there's water there, like we're looking at the edge of a beach or something, but I can't see what we're looking at. There's so much grain, there's so much distortion in this. Whereas in the Hexagon spy satellite, I'm looking at one now, I can see there's planes, I can see runways. I assume this is an airport or a military Air Force base that we're looking at. Yes, it says mapping camera image Kabunica, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, Kabukina Airfield near Moscow. So yeah, it's no question what I'm looking at in this Corona image, but in the Hexagon spy satellite image, but this earlier Discoverer image, mostly, if not for the captions, they'd be lost on me because I honestly thought I was looking at a tower, but no, it's labeled as a runway.
And it's almost certainly to do with the fact that the Discoverer images were so poor that they really couldn't be used. Also, they would be secret. Nobody would know about them because the Discoverer program was always disguised as something else. It wasn't announced. As you say, Clinton was the first president who publicly declared that the Discoverer program had been used. But that was 30, 40 years earlier. It was a secret program. That was the whole point of it. So they couldn't discuss it. They couldn't issue the images. All right, the images were very poor, which is why the KH9 Hexagon came along with much improved optics and much improved camera systems and the requirement to pressurize the film.
According to this picture here, it's captioned as being taken on August 18, 1960. This is the Discoverer 14 image. And as you said, the Clinton years was in the 90s, so that puts into perspective of how long they waited to release this thing. So if this is first generation image, well, I'm sorry, I can't see how this is supposed to debunk the premise that you guys put out in your Hollis article that the film is affected by the vacuum. It's either been affected by the vacuum or it's been severely damaged by radiation, or both. Dark Finn, this is your proof that the vacuum is not going to be a hazard. This is our proof that the vacuum is a hazard.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that vacuum was a hazard and it was used, that's why the pressurization had to be used on the Hexagon, which was 1969, 1970 when it was first used. That was much later. It had nearly 10 years to identify vacuum on film as a problem. And we still don't have a film today, other than the rumors put out by those who want it to be true, that Kodak had produced this anti-vacuum film. It's never been produced. The SO films, special order films, were nothing to do with anti-vacuum or anti-radiation. They were just another piece of false information, fake news, to coin a phrase.
The only information I can find about this film being special is that it was somewhat thinner so they could fit more frames on it.
Yeah.
But I can't find anything about it being designed to be resilient against a vacuum, or in fact, when they had the lunar orbiter probes, they specifically selected a special type of film that had been purposely designed to be resistant against the radiation. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but basically it required about like twice as much exposure to radiation, thrice as much exposure to the radiation to become severely fogged than it would with ordinary film. If you have your film X-rayed when you're traveling overseas and you're coming home to put it through the X-ray machine, oh, it's ruined. This was basically a kind of film that they developed to try and make it less susceptible to that kind of exposure. Just for comparison, we discussed the Discoverer 14 was launched in 1960, right, whereas the Hexagon was called, it operated between 1971 to 1986. Between 1960 and 1971, they've realized, okay, we need to do something about this damage that the film is sustaining, so we must put it in a pressurized system. Previously, they had exposed to the vacuum, and we see this kind of deterioration that the film has suffered. Assuming this is the original one, I don't see any significant damage that would be affecting the Hexagon image.
The KH9 Macking camera image of Kohinka airfield near Moscow. Yeah, I've got that. And you can see the planes. You can even see how many engines they've got. And that is a considerably improved image of an airfield over the previous one, the 1961, which just shows a runway, what they euphemistically call a parking apron. But considering where it is, up in the far northeast corner of the Soviet Union, way above Kamchatka, it's obviously not been used a great deal. Otherwise, there'll be far more activity there. There'll be far more airplanes there. It's not a particularly useful image.
I realize that this is supposed to be a 12 meter per pixel image, but even so, you'd expect to see a bit more detail than that. There's no detail in the surrounding landscape. Am I looking at rocky terrain or is this forest? And plus, the fact that it's black and white doesn't really help either. If this was color, it'd be interesting to see what kind of effects the vacuum would have had on the color. With a black and white image, you're not really missing much as far as the colors are concerned, but, you know, still, there's no detail in this.
In fact, you'd also expect to see some roadways around the area. I mean, it can't be totally isolated. It's certainly off the coast, but you'd expect to see a few images of a roadway, but there aren't any. It's not particularly helpful.
How wide is a road on average? Because this is a 12 meter per pixel image. Let me look that up quickly. Yeah, 3.5 meters average. Oh, that's in Australia. Okay, average width for a road in Russia. Yeah, 3.75 meters. Rural two-lane roads generally span from 18 to 24 feet, 5.5 to 7.3 meters.
Right.
Okay, 12 meter per pixel camera. Okay, so that would be below the resolving capabilities, I guess. 5.5 to 7.3 meters. Yeah, so that's a two-lane road. Okay, yeah, so a two-lane road would be about 7 meters, just below the resolving limits of this camera, so it might appear as a single pixel width line.
Yeah.
Squiggly line, I guess. That's how it would appear in the thing, but we don't see any of that in these pictures.
No, we don't. Of course, don't forget that August 1960 imagery was just after the Gary Powers incident where his U-2 plane got shot down, and Eisenhower had to say, well, we're not going to fly over Russia anymore. They had to produce the satellites to do it.
No, and I also made a point of telling this fella here, this Apollo kid. Now, he's going on about this S-star film again, and he's claiming that it's this S-star plastic. And I said to him, I says, look, I says, yes, it's S-star plastic, but it's the emulsion on the plastic that outgasses the worst. That's what's causing all of those hues to go crazy in the color films. This is the Apollo kid once again. And I told him, I says, look, especially with the Corona satellite and this Apollo film, this ISO 168. I said, well, If you could find a sample of this film and send it to us, we will then send it to the university for testing. And I said, that would put this to bed. Of course, he says SO stands for special order. That says a lot. Okay, yeah, it does say a lot. Like Marcus said, you can make special order into anything you want. And he says they did vacuum testing, they did all these tests. And I'm sure NASA tested those rolls very well back then. And I said, yes, okay. Well then, send us a roll and we'll have it tested at the university. Do you think he'll give us a reply? Every excuse under the sun but a reply saying, yes, I could find it for you, or yes, I'll purchase it and send you a roll. No, they're all the same.
Yeah, they are. Because they have to keep their story straight, that NASA did what it said it did. Because we just proved that at the very worst, they might have lied. They certainly tested it. That's not in dispute. Well, NASA didn't test it. They put it to their contractors. EG&G were doing the testing. And they made a report which basically said, we've tested it. There are problems. You need to address them, like the vacuum testing, the radiation testing. Yes, there are problems with these things. Now you need to address them. Have we ever seen any report saying they've addressed the problems? That's what's missing. It's a vital piece of information that we should have been able to see, that NASA had addressed the problems identified by their contractors, independent contractors, who were doing the best job they could, but NASA did not address those problems. NASA did not create film that could withstand vacuum pressure. Certainly not vacuum pressure on the moon.
Going to say, and given, of course, that the lunar orbiter pictures were specifically selected to be using a special radiation-resistant type film, you would think that would be mandatory on the Apollo missions. Instead, it's for all intents and purposes, yeah, granted it's thinner, but otherwise it's pretty much off-the-shelf film. That A.P. Arnold fellow who David Percy interviewed from Kodak, he said that the film was essentially the same as ordinary film.
Yeah. A.J.P. Arnold, the UK managing director of Hasselblad, who, when asked by David Percy on his film What Happened on the Moon, said they're very good pictures. They're good photographers. He was trying to big up the whole Apollo thing, and he had the role of the Apollo 11 magazine 40.
Some gravel roads in Russia can be wider than necessary, with optimal width being 6 to 7 meters, but some roads are 10 to 11 meters wide. So again, the roads in there would be about 1 pixel wide and appears maybe a 1 pixel wide squiggly line. We don't see any of that in these pictures.
Of course, that is one of the most isolated parts of Russia, that particular image, because they show a map at the top showing where it actually is, right at the top northeast corner of the Soviet Union. Very isolated. Ironically, that is where David Attenborough filmed the seals falling off cliffs, that particular area, in his fairly recent documentary about global warming.
In that case, it might actually be ice we're looking at, a snow-covered terrain, snow-covered mountainside.
That's possible.
Yeah, and if that is snow, well, my God, that must be pretty dusty snow if this darkening of the image implies anything.
Yeah.
I'm speaking facetiously, of course, because this puts into perspective. If we're looking at snow here, look at how much damage this film must have sustained in order to get it to appear so dark.
Well, they've obviously got very good snow plows to keep the runway clear, haven't they? About the only thing they have kept clear in that image. August 1960 was just a few months after the Gary Powers incident. So that was probably one of the very first satellites sent up by America to try to get images, which is what the U-2 spy planes were doing. But the satellites were flying a great deal higher than the U-2 spy planes.
Look at the images even of the one in Egypt here. This was done in June 1967, which was on page 329 in the box. This one here is the Abu Suwayr airfield in Egypt. Look at how pixelated this is.
Yeah.
This is what I would expect radiation to do. As a matter of fact, this almost looks like the black and white film that I had in the chamber. And I only took that down to toward 10 to the -3. That's as low as I could get that chamber. I purchased a larger pump to do it. And
Wow.
it sort of looks like this.
It doesn't really show very much at all, does it?
No?
I mean, that's certainly not snow, not in Egypt, probably sand.
There's many pictures that have been released from the Hubble during transit of the South Atlantic anomaly. It looks like it was taken in a snowfield because of all the streaks of the protons, the cosmic rays and whatnot that are striking the CCD detector. Granted, that's a digital thing, but the same principle applies. In the case of film, you've got the film being streaked by the cosmic rays, and in the case of the digital cameras, you get all these cosmic rays and protons and whatnot striking the CCD detector and rendering certain pixels dead,
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes. KH4 refers to a series of probes here. It says here the KH4 Corona M. It's a series. It's not a specific spacecraft. It's a series of them.
Like with the KH9, there are actually over 20 missions using the KH9 name. And that was the one that transitioned between photographic film and digital.
I misread this. Read the caption. It says KH9 mission 1042-1. I'm not sure if this was pressurized, but oh my goodness, it's completely brightened. There's nothing in here. There's no detail or anything.
That was the problem that Phil Pressel, who developed the camera system, had to solve. He worked for, PerkinElmer in Connecticut. And because it was classified until 2011, he wasn't allowed to talk about it or discuss it with anybody, including his wife. It was obviously highly classified and didn't leak out. I only heard about it in 2019.
Yeah, there was a lot of secrets on both sides of the Iron Curtain that didn't get released. When they did the N1 program, no one but a few people outside of Russia even knew of the launches. That's how well tight-lipped it was. The Americans, granted they had all their space missions take place in full view of the world, their CIA was basically no different to the KGB, and people were living under almost tyrannical rule of these intelligence agencies. You keep quiet or we kill you.
Yeah.
People will stay quiet about it.
Yeah, they did.
I remember during the debate I had with the astronaut, Michael Mullane, he was telling me that nobody would be able to keep a secret about it being a hoax. And I said, well, you flew two of your shuttle flights were Department of Defense missions, and some of the details, I actually looked them up before the program, some of the details of those flights were still classified. And I said, I'm sure you're not at liberty to tell me the classified nature of your two secret missions.
To which he didn't reply, as I remember.
Yeah, he just basically doubled down on this, saying that no one would be able to keep a secret about the hoax. Well, what do you want to tell me about your two flights, your two ladder shuttle flights, which were highly classified? What were you doing up there? Were you putting nuclear bombs in space? Were you putting kinetic bombardment weapons in space? Were you putting anti-satellite launches? What were you doing up there? I found a document regarding the film they used on Lunar Orbiter. The film they used on Lunar Orbiter was called SO Special Order 243 film. This film requires 100 rads to become 50% fogged by radiation. FYI, 100 rads, that's considered life-threatening to humans. Even at that kind of levels of radiation, this was specifically designed to only become 50% fogged. Okay, so which puts into perspective that, you would think they would have given the Apollo astronauts the same kind of film for their Hasselblad cameras to ensure that they wouldn't ever suffer any kinds of radiation damage, but no, just same as ordinary film, according to J.P. Arnold.
One other thing, in that document you sent through, Robert, they say they used film SO242 in that film. So obviously 243 for the lunar orbiter came a couple of years later. So they were developing the film or changing the designation of it.
The type of film they had on Apollo, SO368 for the lunar surface photography, and SO168 for other situations. Okay. The point I was trying to make is basically that this film was specifically designed to be radiation resistant, such that the films from lunar orbiter wouldn't become too fogged or blurred or whatever from the solar and cosmic radiation that they were destined to encounter.
This is the one that they used in Apollo 11. For example, the AS11395750, that was taken from inside of the LM. Yeah, that was a Kodak Ektachrome 3400 Panatomic X Aerial ASA 80 black and white film. That's the one I was thinking of, because in this live stream that we did, I was said that they were using the 3000 series. This was the one that I was thinking of here, was the Ektachrome 3400 Panatomic X.
Just bear in mind one thing. Kodak Ektachrome is a color film, transparency material. Panatomic X is a black and white film, very high grain, very good clarity, good resolution. So to say that it's a Kodak Ektachrome film Pan X is not technically correct. Somebody's either got it wrong or they produced a film that nobody's ever heard of.
So back to this Corona spy satellite. If this image from 1960 was shot that far north in Russia, it stands to reason this entire region would be covered in snow. And given how dark and fogged this image is, I would have to say this is either damaged by the vacuum or the radiation or both. If you're looking at a snow-covered landscape, you'd expect that area to be white.
Yeah. Or penguins were crapping rather diffusely. Oh no, there weren't any penguins in the Arctic, were there? Polar bears. Yes, crapping. Too many seals for lunch. Oh dear, sorry about that. Getting a bit off track here. Snow, when photographed, can look dark, especially if it's photographed from space where the radiation would affect the film. So we still haven't had an answer to our basic question. Can anybody produce photographic film used during Apollo or any of these spy satellites that are resistant to radiation? And where's your evidence?
This is the one that I put into the chamber that I took a picture of that tree, and I bracketed that tree with loads of photographs. It was Kodak 2238 panchromatic separation film ISO 6, which means you need a heck of a lot of light.
Yeah, ISO 6 is very slow film. It's probably got good resolution,
Oh, yeah.
but it would need a lot of light to produce the image.
Yeah, and that's why I took it when the sun was right over on the left side, because it lit that tree up like a Christmas tree. This was the one that fogged the least, but this is the film that also, when I put outside the microwave oven, look what happened to it when I gave it a 1 second burst.
Affected by radiation.
Oh, yeah. Although, of
So,
course, a magnetron is different from cosmic radiation. I get that. But it
Yeah,
was outside the door, and I left the door open that much. I've showed pictures of the film sitting there right outside the door as I was doing it. But in
yeah,
any case, yeah, so that was the film that I used there. It was the Kodak 2238 panchromatic separation, black and white. So
yeah,
that was the series that I was using on that one other one. I bought 5 of the Kodak 3238s. So that's the 3000 series, and that is the 3000 series here that these guys are using. This one here that they're using is the 3400. So it's the same series of film. And look what happened to it.
yeah,
so basically, the take-home message here is that Darkfin cited these pre-hexagon corona images as unpressurized as evidence against us. But it turns out, looking at the actual photos that are delivered, we see serious signs of damage, which can only be either by radiation or vacuum. And if this was a color film, it probably would have shown up even more prominently the level of damage it sustained.
How does he know it's unpressurized?
Well,
As
they
you
said it was unpressurized in the papers and stuff. Like I said, they originally were using acetone, but they found the acetone-based film, and that was jamming very, very easily because it was becoming so brittle in the vacuum of space. So they switched over to polyester film.
When I was talking to Tim Trumbull about Mel Gibson's Braveheart, he had indicated that that was the first time that Mel Gibson put that on S-Star film. And guess what happened when they put that in through the projector the first time? The static electricity built up on it so much that it went poof like this, and it started a fire in the projectors. That just goes to show you what happens to this film. It's plastic, of course it's going to build a charge up on it if it's in an atmosphere.
yeah, it's flammable because it's made from crude oil.
Precisely.
Yeah,
Speaking of the static charge, somebody asked a question about that on the last live stream we did about the kinds of effects the static electricity, the static charges will have on the moon. And it's worth mentioning as well that when the moon enters the plasma sheet of the Earth, when it gets electrically charged by the plasma, by the solar winds and whatnot, because the lunar dust and the bedrock is made of the same material, light charges repel, so they want to rise off the surface of the moon. And we see that as the so-called levitating dust. There are the famous pictures from the Surveyor spacecraft which show the dust levitating off the ground. And well, it begs the question, right? If you got all this dust lifting off the moon and then falling back down to the surface of the moon again after the charge goes away, well, how are you going to get bootprint trails, 50, 60 years later from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter?
good point.
You would think that the dust would fall back down once the moon rotated and the sun went down below the horizon, because that only thing keeping it there is the sun's charge. So according to this other video that I was watching that's physicist, as soon as the moon rotates and the sun goes behind the horizon, it's going to fall back down again. So guess what's going to happen? The lunar reflectors, well, if they're there, they're going to be covered, aren't they? And that goes with the footprints and the tracks. And that's 50 years of this happening over that. And yet, why do these tracks still show up in these LRO images? This is what I don't get.